Good morning. This is the House Appropriations Committee. It's Wednesday, May 20th, 2026. It's a little after 10:20 in the morning, and we are taking up another bill. We have a couple of bills today. We may have a couple more that we've heard or about to hear, and so this will be flexible on our schedule. But right now we have two this morning, and the first one is S-328, an act relating to housing and common interest communities, which is a new term that I haven't heard before.
I just want to hear a definition.
Well, we'll hear it, I bet. We have Ledge Council here for a camera. So, and we have Ted here for joint fiscal, and we may have Chair Mahali coming yet also. So why don't you tell us about the bill?
Sure. For the record, Cameron Wood, Office of Legislative Counsel. So this is the Senate's version of its housing bill this year. If you all recall earlier in the session, you all passed on the House H775, which included a lot of housing provisions that went over to the Senate Economic Development Committee and has passed out of that committee and is moving through the Senate process. This is the Senate version that they passed out and came over to the House. There were a lot of provisions in 775 that you all passed and S328 as it came over from the Senate that were very similar. There were a few provisions that were in 775 that were not in S328. And there were a few things that were in S328 that were not in H775. And so what the House General Committee has generally done is combine those two bills together. They went with, in some sections, they went with the Senate version. If there was a conflict, they chose to go with the Senate version of the language. And in other instances, they chose to keep the House version of the language. So I'll mention those as we walk through. And then there's a few new sections that were added in that were not in either bill as they initially passed its body of origin. So I'll share my screen. I'll start with the House version of the strike all amendment. And then, as you all know, this did go to Ways and Means, and Ways and Means has an amendment to this report as well. And then, Madam Chair, as you mentioned, I have a draft proposal of amendment from this committee to take a look as well.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so this is the strike all amendment proposal from the General and Housing Committee. Page 1, section 1 is regarding common interest community resources. So here's where I get to pause and tell you what a common interest community is. You all are kind of familiar with what a homeowners association is. Mm-hmm. That's a common interest community. In statute, they're not called homeowners associations. They're governed by an association, yes, but the development itself is called a common interest community. Because it's a community where you as an individual own a unit within the community, but the common elements are owned by the association. And so it could be a common interest community, it could be a condominium, or it could be a planned community. And it depends on who or what owns the elements that are owned in common. So
okay, yeah, so I'm thinking my parents actually would have lived in one of those at some point. It was all houses, but then there was a community meeting room that everybody could use when they wanted to do something. So that would be interesting. Yeah, so is it mostly usually monthly homeowners fees associated with these?
There could be.
There might not be.
It could be.
Okay. Tom?
So if they're analogous, what is public information about common interest communities? Because each of those common interest communities is going to have their own set of bylaws that are going to be proprietary or whatever to, I mean, there's national rules about homeowners associations and what can be done. Right. What is it that the Secretary of State is providing?
Great question, sir. I will share with you the same concerns that I shared with the House General Committee, and the same concerns I shared with the House Ways and Means Committee about this section. So initially there was a bill that was introduced by a member to require the Secretary of State to contract with a nonprofit entity to create a common interest community resource center. My understanding is the concern is these are very, very complicated organization types. As you mentioned, they're governed by bylaws, they're governed by rules, they're governed by the declaration that has to be filed initially in the town or towns where the community is going to be located. So there's a lot of overlay of how these organizations are created, how they exist, who owns what, how you engage with the community, limitations on the community. And there is a title that you all passed, Title 27A, which is very lengthy and extensive, that kind of regulates how these entities are set up and how they have to govern themselves, et cetera. So there was a bill to have the Secretary of State contract with an entity to provide resources to the public. And it talked about, resources, materials, to develop materials to help people understand how these organizations exist and have to be governed. The concern that you're raising is a concern that was discussed in committee about the fact that you have the statutes, but within each community, they are governed differently because they have their own bylaws. The bylaws have to break down what portion of the unit do you as an individual own, what portions of the unit are owned in common, what portions of the unit may be limited common elements, which is an element that's owned in common, but you as an individual have exclusive use to it. So you could think of like your porch, maybe a limited common element where it's owned by everybody else, but you have the exclusive use of that. So these are very complicated. And so there was this, resource center that was contemplated being created. The committee, ultimately, after hearing from the Secretary of State's office, chose not to go in that direction. And they wanted the Secretary of State to provide some level of information to the public because these organizations do have to register, or these associations do have to register with the Secretary of State as an organization. And the Secretary of State's office mentioned that they do sometimes get questions from the public about them. Circling all the way back to this language in particular, this section, I mentioned to the committee, this was language that was kind of worked out and massaged between members of the committee and the Secretary of State's office. I mentioned to the committee that I don't know what public information is either. And all it says is the information shall include the governing statutes. So I told them that the Secretary of State could comply with this section simply by putting a website up available through the Secretary of State that says common interest community statutes can be found here. And they post a link to your website where we publish the statutes that govern the community. So I don't really see this language as being, very descriptive about what the Secretary of State is supposed to do. And I told the committee that it may be better to simply get verbal agreement from the Secretary of State that they would do what you're asking as opposed to putting this in statute, because I don't really see this having any legal effect or legal consequence or legal direction to the Secretary of State.
So I'm going to stop this conversation here because we are not the policy committee and we have another building here in half an hour and we've gotten to section 1.
Deal.
So we'll keep,
We haven't quite got through section.
we're going to be moving on. You can all have lovely conversations about stuff later, but we need to sort of keep it high level and get to the money part. And because we have an amendment from Ways and Means, and we have an amendment, which I can't even remember what it says, but it's okay. Look at it.
I will work to be succinct. Through. Okay.
We're very interested. That's the thing.
Totally
I
understood.
love that. But at the moment, we're going to just have to.
I love it. I love it. So, okay. The next section, section 2, is related to service supported housing. This is going to create an advisory council to exist within the Department of Disabilities, Aging, and Independent Living. You can see here it's overseen by the department in subsection B. It has membership. I won't walk through each of the individual members. What this is my understanding from the advocates who have requested this. Last year in Act 69, you created a study group or an advisory group to create a state plan to develop housing for individuals with developmental disabilities. This is a continuation of the work of that group. This would make the advisory council permanent, put it under Dale. And you can see they'll meet at least monthly. Has the administrative technical legal assistance from Dale. It works with VHCB on providing advice to VHCB regarding expenditure for production of housing for individuals with developmental disabilities. And then you can see that they are required to submit a report in subsection F. And it's got some information about what should be included in that annual report, including a housing needs assessment for individuals who are served by the Developmental Disability Service System of Care, activities undertaken, recommendations for future legislative action, and funding sources to help develop housing for this population of people. That was in the Senate version of the bill. So that was not in H775 as it passed out of the House. The House General Committee has made some very minimal changes to that section based on some feedback from the advocates.
Okay.
Okay, section 3, we get to the Vermont State Treasurer Credit Facility. This is as the version passed from the House in 775. So if you all remember the State Treasurer's Credit Facility, they can provide up to 10% of the state's average cash balance. This is here on lines 14 and 15.
We heard about upping this to the 12.5.
Yeah, increasing it to 12 and a half.
This is familiar. Okay.
And then adding the ability to create up to 1% for offsite constructed housing. And that's there on the top of page 5. Okay. So the Senate version was slightly different. The Senate version did not authorize that additional 1%. The Senate version only included the increase from 10 to 12.5. The House wanted to go with, or the House General Committee is recommending to go with the House version that includes that 1% for offsite constructed housing.
Did we approve that? I guess we approved that through the House last time.
This is essentially as it came out of H775. Yes, ma'am.
So that came to our committee.
So this is the House's version of that section.
Okay.
So then we get to page 6, section 4, you have the offsite construction accelerator pilot program. Initially, this was through Department of Housing and Community Development to work with municipalities and to have a pilot to try to, create these bulk purchasing of offsite constructed housing and to be able to locate areas to site them and build them. This has changed based on the Ways and Means Amendment. So I'll come back to this in just a second.
Yeah.
But this as it came out of House General, this is the version that you all had passed out of the House.
Okay.
This was not in the Senate version as 328. Okay, so page 8, section 5, Vermont Economic Development Authority. This is amending the definition of eligible facility or eligible project to allow, after consultation with Vermont Housing Finance Agency, it allows the Economic Development Authority to fund multi-unit housing developments of 5 or more units when they're working jointly with a financing lender. This was in the House and the Senate, so it was in both bills. It's been slightly tweaked a little bit to make sure that it works for what VHFA and Vermont Economic Development Authority are looking to accomplish. The changes as it came out of the House version are it adds in here that the authority, so VEDA, shall not finance portions or phases of a multi-unit housing development.
Sorry.
That's great.
She wasn't talking to you, she said.
I'm so sorry. That is a roll call noise. It has nothing to do with you, Cameron. I was not expecting this. Let me see if I can find out what it is, unless anybody else has already heard. Sorry, let's keep going till I hear what it is. We always have a couple of minutes.
So this makes some minor changes to what you passed in the House to ensure that it's accomplishing what VEDA and VHFA had agreed to. Like I said, the changes are adding in that it's portions or phases. So VEDA can't finance portions or phases of a development. They wanted to be clear that there may be portions that VEDA can finance and there may be portions that they shouldn't finance. And then the request was to add in this subsection I to say that VEDA cannot finance portions or phases of a housing development when VHFA determines that that portion or phase is primarily developed for occupancy by persons and families of low or moderate income. The thought being VHFA is the entity that finances those, not VITA. And so VITA shouldn't be financing projects that in theory should be going to VHFA. So this is the language that those two entities have agreed to.
Okay.
You have section 6, some changes in DHIP. This is as the section was passed out of the House in H 775. It's an amendment on page 10 that authorizes the department to advance funding for VHIP developments. Currently, it's a reimbursement program. This language would allow them to advance that funding up front. Again, this was in 775. The only difference is adding.
I'm sorry to interrupt here. You think it's on H 657?
Yeah.
That was the homeless youth and,
It's on the
okay. All right. So we have to go up for a roll call. This is our carefully orchestrated morning is now